So this first chapter, we're just going to give you kind of an overview of what it means to do managerial economics. As I do these slides, I will be writing on the slides. I will scan the slides and make them into a PDF afterwards. So if you want to, you could either print out these slides and write it out with me, or you could look at the scan of these slides as well. So in this first chapter, basically I'm using the publisher's PowerPoints. That way I can spend my time kind of explaining each of these slides in greater detail. I figure that's better than making very good PowerPoints that I don't talk about. And here's our overall organization of this chapter. It's useful, I guess, to see it all kind of very quickly, but we'll talk about it all in detail here. So the question then becomes one of, well, what does econ have that they can provide to the business setting for the manager? And to understand that kind of thing, what managerial economics really does is it then emphasizes this difference that you probably would have talked about very briefly in your intro courses, of a difference between accounting profits, which would be your difference between revenue and costs, where the costs are explicit costs where you actually have to spend money, versus economic profits, which is your revenue minus your in this case, not your explicit costs, but your explicit plus your implicit costs, where the implicit costs are covering my opportunity costs. My apologies for the way in which this lighting issue. I'm not really sure. I think it's a focus issue. The only solution I have for it is by removing and then placing back the thing. So accountants don't take into account the opportunity costs, which economists do. Well, that would be useful. That would be a useful thing that economists could add to how a manager makes a decision. Then, how does that manager account for the difference in time between when they pay out costs versus when they capture revenues? And how can they do all of that to maximize profit? So the whole point of managerial economics is really about talking more about how to maximize profits for that firm. Nothing more different than that. So what does the manager do? Well, basically, in this case, the manager essentially does what they are, they're hired to do, which in this case would mean that they're hired by someone, they're given a goal, and the whole point of that manager is then that they direct the efforts of everyone else, of all of the people that report to that manager, right? So that they can achieve that goal, right? That goal being, most of the time, being higher profits. And so then what they do to get those highest profits, they then have to make the pricing decisions. They have to make the decisions about how high of a quality of an item will be delivered. They have to purchase those inputs to produce that output. They have to make the decision of how many inputs will I make to get the number of outputs that I want. It's a pretty complicated task. But it's one that economists can actually add quite a bit to, because what economics is all about, just to remind you, is that economics is all about being a science of scarcity. We're basically understanding the entire world as one where there's only a limited amount of resources to fulfill unlimited wants and needs. How do I rationalize that trade-off being made? How do I rationalize how many workers I hire? How do I rationalize what kind of inputs I'll use? All that's going to come from economics. And so then that leads us to our formal definition here then. That formal definition being one of managerial economics, it can then be formally defined. And I think this is actually a pretty succinct definition here. How do I then direct scarce resources to help the manager efficiently achieve their goal? That's pretty much what it can be. Now, these are all kinds of questions that managerial economics as a discipline can answer. But again, it's primarily about how do I get managers to make scarcity decisions so that they achieve their goal. Their goal being most of the time the maximization of profit. So what does it take to then be that effective manager? To be that effective manager, then, I need to have some way then of understanding, okay, what are the things that are limited for me? Where do I face my constraints? Yeah, I want to achieve maximized profit, but it'd probably be more useful to understand like what time period that is, or things like that, right? It's useful to know what kind of goal, what explicitly my goal is. How am I going to understand those profits being earned? It might not be as simple as, right, it might be useful to know under what time frame are my costs going to be defined, under what accounting rules am I going to recognize certain revenue items or cost items. Within any structure with employees and with workers, I need, and with consumers, I need to know what that incentive structure looks like, because economics is all about incentives, right? Either me trying to encourage someone to do something or trying to discourage them from doing something. Right? And that's what managers then have to do. They have to set up structures that, for me as a consumer, right, set up a frequent flyer program so that I fly American Airlines even when I don't want to, so that I am incentivized to accumulate miles to fly them even more, right? Or to discourage me from, here is an interesting one. So when I just flew back to Hawaii, the first bag was $25. The second bag, luggage, was $35. The third bag was $100. So that's a huge disincentive, right? Discouragement to packing more than 2 bags. Really, to packing anything at all. Being an effective manager then is also then understanding about what is my market structure. What am I selling? Who am I selling it to? Obviously, there's a time value of money, meaning that I can't do everything right now. I have to pay to borrow money. If I'm accumulating money right now more than what I need, there's a time value of that money. That money can, it becomes less valuable over time, right? Because of inflation. And then that also is useful to employ a marginal analysis. That marginal analysis being one where I look at my marginal benefits and I compare them to my marginal costs. Or essentially I say, what's the benefit of doing something one more time? That's what marginal means. And I'm comparing it to the cost of doing something one more time. Now, what that essentially means for us then when we're trying to understand the profits again. So going back to that issue. Primary and central to all of this would be that the firm is just trying to maximize profit. Love it or hate it, that's what firms do. But the difference would be, what kind of profit are we talking about? The accounting profit would mean I'm just comparing my revenue, or basically the price times right. Let's say I'm selling t-shirts and I sell 5,000 t-shirts at $5 a piece. Well, that would be, right, in this case, $25,000, right? 5,000 shirts at $5 a piece. Now, what's the cost of producing those goods and services? Well, then I'd be talking about like the cotton. I'd be talking about the store, employees, advertising, right? We can think of a lot of different costs that it takes to make and sell t-shirts. What economics profit, what that notion adds to it, is the opportunity cost, which means that I have to look up the implicit cost of giving up the best alternative. Meaning, economic profit is not only, it's still the total revenue, but now I'm subtracting again the explicit costs, which I had identified right there, right? The cotton, the store, the employees, and the ads, plus the implicit costs. What that store could have been used for instead. What my workers could have been doing instead. What that ad space could have been used for alternatively. What that cotton could have been used for alternatively. What could I have been making instead of shirts, right? I could have been maybe making war uniforms. And if I was at war, it probably would be better if I were making war uniforms, right? Just like if I were making cars, right, I might be making money making cars, but again, if we're at war, it might be better if I make tanks, right? And so if you look at something like World War II, that would be a situation where a company like GM could certainly have made accounting profit making refrigerators and automobiles and whatever big companies can make, but it was better for them and for the country as a whole to be making war materials, right? And that's taking into account the opportunity cost. Why are profits so important? Who doesn't like to make money? But what they are is for an economist, is they are a signal. And if I'm getting the highest profit I can for using a resource in a certain kind of way, then that means I'm using that resource in the best way possible. So that's why profits are important. Because they tell me, they are the way that I know that I'm using the resource the way I should be using it. Now, when we look at the firm, there's this tendency to use what's called the 5 forces model. And what that 5 forces model does is it then looks at entry, the input suppliers, rivalry, substitutes, and confluence, power buyers. It's looking at how each of these 5 forces contribute individually to growth within the firm, profits within the industry, the size of the firm. And without getting into the detail of each of these 5 things, which are basically described in the textbook, what they do, the reason why they're useful is because you have to, the reason why a picture like this is useful is that a manager, when they have to make a decision about how to maximize profit, they have to deal with all of these things simultaneously. Right? And so the job of the manager isn't just about raising the price and trying to cut costs. They deal with all these other things. And we can think certainly of decisions that certain managers have made that we disagree with because we think that it might save some costs, but it really does something bad, for instance, in terms of let me just talk about one here. And this is just the example because it seems topical right now. The one I was just thinking about just now was I read an article that was talking about this 5 forces model, and it was dealing with the fact that Costco, which used to use American Express as its sole exclusive credit card company, now uses Visa. So they switched from their supplier being, right, and that's how Costco views companies like American Express as a supplier. Instead of American Express, they were going to use Visa, and they were going to use Chase Bank issuing Visa credit cards. There were huge switching costs of that. And it turns out that people have been grumpier in general with the customer service at Chase than they were with American Express. The critique that was made against Costco in terms of its profitability, and it's a quite profitable firm, and you could talk about the industry as a whole, right, is that the wholesale industry, like Sam's Club and Costco, it's a profitable industry, is that, yes, Costco may have saved some money by not paying American Express the high fees that they were charging, but on the other hand, right, is that can hurt profitability as a whole if I'm losing customers, right? All of these things, again, the way that firms make money, they have to deal with all 5 of these kinds of forces at work. Now, as we put this together in terms of the incentive structure then, again, the profits are important because that is my positive incentive to use the resources in that kind of way. But then what it takes a good manager to do is is to encourage, for instance, workers to work hard, right? It's to encourage people to not waste resources while they're making certain products for the customers. So we have to make an incentive structure for that, right? Why do here's a good way to look at it. Why, despite all the ways in which companies try to cut costs, why do companies still offer vacation days? Right? It's not because they're generous. It's not because they're kind. But you get offered, in a lot of companies, a lot of businesses, people are offered, let's say, a week of paid vacation. Why is that done? Not necessarily because the manager is nice, but rather because it means that I get to rest for a week and not worry about how to put food on the table. And because I'm resting for that week, I come back and then I'm quite productive. Paid vacation then serves as a positive incentive to doing my work well. Just like good health insurance might do the same thing, right? It might encourage me then to say, hey, I really need to stay with this job because the benefits are really good. But now, within every market, then, we have to understand that it's not just the employees that I need to worry about, right? Because it's a market transaction, there are also consumers in this situation. Now, when we talk about who has the most power in that kind of position, we then have to talk about the certain rivalries that exist. Either the rivalry that exists between consumers and producers. Is one consumer demanding a good that only certain producers can make, or are there lots of producers all fighting for the same consumer? There's also then rivalry among the consumers for certain things, and there's also rivalry among the producers to be let's say, the dominant supplier and that kind of thing. So whether someone has market power depends on their bargaining position and the rivalries that exist. And then, quite frankly, within any market, the government's going to get involved in some way and regulate that market to some extent. To give you an idea, an example of these rivalries that exist, we actually see a lot of these rivalries right now with Hawaiian Electric. right? We see the rivalry that exists between consumers and producers is that consumers can make their own electricity with solar panels, with wind and whatnot, and it creates a rivalry then between the consumer and the producer, where the producer in some case, right, can say, no, only so many companies can, or only so many consumers can sell their electric back to the company, right? And consumers, if you want solar panels, only so many can install solar panels. We can also create rivalry then among consumers, right? If I'm a big business, I generally get a cheaper rate at which I can sell electric than, or buy electric than other kinds of consumers, like residents and whatnot. And then I can also create rivalries between producers, right? And I can have certain kinds of firms that want to get involved in this industry, right? And that would be the rivalry that we see, that Hawaiian Electric is getting consumers from, or getting bids from other companies, because these companies are trying to produce in that market. And who's getting involved? The government. Right, the government's getting involved in that and trying to dictate that rivalry that exists. Now, important as well, and as I referred to it a little bit earlier here, but managers do need to worry quite often about the time value of money. And that basically means that because there is that time difference between when I might spend money, or when my costs are borne, and when I receive the benefits, that the difference in what that dollar can purchase from me, or the purchasing power, is going to be different. If I had my choice, I would rather get my money now than I would get it later, right? And love it or hate it, right? What's an example of this? I like to look at how we kind of exist everywhere. You may notice that when you purchase gasoline, some gas stations do the cash discount versus credit card, and it is true that part of that discount is motivated by the fact that gas stations have to pay a fee for every credit card that's used, right? There's like a commission, a transaction charge. But also, if you run a business and you have credit card transactions, you don't typically get paid right away you don't typically get that money right away. You typically have to wait a few days, maybe even up to a month, to actually get the cash. Wouldn't it be better to get the cash right away? Could use it right away. That would be another reason to encourage people to give me money right away, right, by making it cheaper. You see it in other ways as well, right? That, for instance, I just booked a hotel for 2 months from now. It was cheaper to prepay for it versus pay for it when I go to the hotel. Part of that is motivated by the fact that now I'm not going to be able to cancel that hotel reservation, but probably the more important thing for a company might be that they can use that money now rather than wait until I actually travel to spend that money. What managers then need to do is they need to then employ a present value analysis to look at that timing issue and to properly space out that timing issue. So let's look at how that exists then. Now, this is not a specific finance course or a simple accounting course. What I care more about for our purposes is that you get an idea of how what present value is. And again, it's just that there is a different purchasing power value based on when the thing occurs. That present value of a single future value, or in other words, what would I have to do today, like in terms of an interest rate, what would I have to do today to match the interest rate in the future, to match the future value? Right, so if I know that future money is less valuable than it is today, then that means that I need to do something with my money now that's going to generate a return that's going to at least equal what I'm losing by not getting the money until the future. That's given by my present value equation. And that present value equation, seen in probably a little bit of a simpler way then, is it's basically the present value is equal to the future value minus the opportunity cost of waiting. So the goal is then to get a rate of return that's equal to my opportunity cost of waiting. If I can't do it, then there's a cost to waiting. And you could see this then taken out in to a stream of values, right? So I could sum up all those differences. For our case, for this class, this doesn't need to be your concern about this stream of future values. But again, you could understand it as time period 1, time period 2, and I could sum all those time periods. So let's see how that looks then. So let's say that I'm getting money over a 3-year time period, right? And that I'm getting $10,000, let's say right away, or year 1, $50,000 in year 2, $100,000 in year 3. So the key point of this discussion is that this is not a $160,000 deal that I've just done. If we say that the interest rate is 3%, then basically what we're saying is that by not getting the money, the $50,000 until year 2, I'm losing a 3% rate of return I could have been receiving now. And even in year 1, if I'm not receiving it till the end of year 1, I'm losing 3% interest. So what again we could do is then take each of these values, the $10,000, the $50,000, the $100,000, and divide each of them by the addition of 1 plus the interest rate, or 3% understood as 0.03. So that I have 10,000 plus 1.2. So that I can properly discount each of these by that 3% interest rate, so that I can see that my $160,000 deal is actually only worth $148,000. 352.7. And then besides my present value, we can also look at the net present value. The only difference here is that because it's net, that means I'm then just subtracting my costs from that. Now the discussion changes if my asset is something that can exist forever, has a perpetual value. And a perpetual value here, sorry, I don't know why it is doing that. So, at least you can see that I'm not a professional videographer. What we then see is that if the asset is something that is of indefinite time period, that what I need to look at then is I need to basically extend it all the way out to infinity. And what we'll basically essentially see here is that the as we go into future and farther into the future time periods, that the present value is falling more. What do we get from all this? You know, besides all the mathematics of this. is that what it means to maximize profits means that I can't just say I'm trying to maximize the difference between revenue and cost, which is how you would have understood it in your principles classes. That's something much more, we need to be more precise about our discussion. And the way that we're more precise about it is that we talk about things in terms of present value. And that I'm actually trying to maximize the present value of my profits, where PRI stands for profits. And when we then use that to then talk about how we're going to value that firm, then what we can start to do here is create an equation where I'm looking at then a rate of growth within the company, and have those rate of growth within the company, and that it's not generating any dividends or paying anything out to consumers. That if it's not paying out these dividends, growing at a constant rate, then over time, again, we have that same discussion where I have my company existing in one time period, then growing slightly in the second time period, growing even more in the third time period, yet at the same time, I have my interest rate existing in each of these three time periods, giving me my present value, so that my equation looks something like my profits approaching zero, right, with a reflection of both the interest rate to give me the present value and the growth rate so that I can get the future value of the firm. And that kind of discussion is different when the firm is paying out dividends. Because then what I need to do is I need to account for those dividends here. That would mean that I'm taking into account based on the what the value of the firm is, because that's going to be, dividends take money out of profits, right? If a firm is paying out dividends, that means they're not reinvesting it back into the company. So what does that mean for us? What that means for us as a strategy, I struggle with this from time to time of like, I find this really cool and interesting, but you may just find what I just did for the past 5 or 10 minutes incredibly boring. But it's not. I mean, let me show you something here. Let me kind of go into this here, right? That if I were to look at I want to look at two companies here, just to show you this kind of decision that the firm is making here. The first one I'm going to look at is Consolidated Edison. They sell electricity, nothing that interesting. It's very boring kind of business. They sell electricity, people pay their electric bills. Pays a dividend of 67 cents for every share. That's all their profits. Can I look at more data here? I think they would tell me more data if I wanted it. It's just not. Here we go. It doesn't. Never mind. What I was trying to get at here, and it's not exactly working because this is impromptu. What I was trying to get at here is that this firm has made a decision to devote a lot of their money to come out of their profits and be paid to drive a dividend that certain people really want if you're an investor. So they drive up their stock price by offering a very high dividend. Let's look at another company though. Don't think they pay as high of a dividend, although I could be mistaken. American Water Works, which sells water, operates a lot of water utility companies, offers a significantly less, even in terms of a percent difference, right, in terms of the dividend offered. That was a managerial decision. There's nothing that dictates why a firm offers a certain dividend or not. Let's look at another example here. United Airlines does not offer a dividend at all, versus Southwest Airlines, which does. It's all managerial decision. And it's all about then the value of the firm based on that kind of structure. Okay. That's why it's important for the manager then to understand that. Because it says actually a great deal about the rate of the growth within the firm and how those profits are changing over time. And if what we see here then is that if the growth rate in the profits is then less than the interest rate, and both are not changing, they're both constant, then, and only then, when we're trying then to maximize the short-term profit, would you then be able to maximize the long-term profit? Those are really big assumptions, and it doesn't often happen. And so because it doesn't often happen, this is why we then say that sometimes when a manager makes a decision, they're being penny wise but pound foolish, meaning that they're maximizing their short-term profits at the expense of their long-term profits. Which means that our critique of firms in that way then is reasonable and rational. Now, the other thing that then we as economists try to encourage managers to do is to think in terms of margins, which means that we want managers to maximize the difference between their marginal benefits and their marginal, their total benefits and their total costs. And the way that they manage they maximize the difference between their total benefits and their total costs. To do this, they're going to set their marginal benefit equal to their marginal cost, or the change in their benefits to doing something one more time equal to the change in the cost to doing something one more time. If they can do that on the margin, that ends up maximizing the total differences. And that's what we see right here, right? Is that then what the manager has to do is they have to say, okay, if I hire a worker for 1 more hour, how much extra work do I get out of them? How much does it cost to hire that worker 1 more time? Right? And if I can compare that difference, and if I see that there is no difference in the benefit and the cost and the margin, then I'll be maximizing my net benefit. And that's what you see right here, is that if I set my marginal benefits equal to my marginal cost, then I'll be maximizing my my total benefit. And that's what we see on these slides then. That the manager should try to control things up until the point where marginal benefits are equal to the marginal costs. And at that point, then the marginal net benefits are 0. Because the marginal net benefits are 0, then my total net benefit will be maximized. You do not need to worry about this slide. You're not doing calculus in this course. If you're interested in this kind of thing, though, this would be first order partial derivatives, which I imagine if you like math, you just love what I said, but if you hate it, you can ignore that I said it. And then we kind of see this kind of understanding, at least of it from right here, that I'm then trying to then compare what these functions look like in terms of the margin here. I'd want to say, okay, how much do things change by when I do something one more time? I'm not going to force you to define these first derivatives, but I could say if I change q one more time, what do things change by? Okay, well then in this case, right, 250q minus 4q squared. Again, this is not a calculus-based course. You do not need to know this, but if you have a somewhat of a simple understanding of this, is that the power rule would tell me is that that's my first derivative. And that if this is q squared, then it's 2q. So that I could find out how much I should make. Right? That marginal benefits equals marginal cost when the q is equal to 25. By making 25, my marginal benefits will equal my marginal costs. And my maximum benefits the difference will be maximized. And so the way that would look would be that would be happening at quantity 25. That it'd be maximizing the difference between these two by having the slope of the two be equal to each other. The slope of the benefit curve being the marginal benefit, the slope of the cost curve being the marginal cost curve. And probably the best way to understand this is actually by doing this as a drop-down graph here. Right, is that if I were to plot it out, that what we would see is that in the beginning, the difference between the two gets maximized when the slope is equal here. And you see that on slide 29, I guess, if you're putting it together with slide 29. Is that if I plot out the magnitude of these slopes, you'll see that the difference between the two, or if I'm looking at the difference, then that difference in the benefits, right, it's very small, it gets larger and larger, then gets smaller and smaller, and you see that right here. And if I want to understand that marginal decision being maximized in a slightly different way, then what I could just say is that, okay, right, I can find the point of intersection of the marginal benefits and the marginal costs, and that would tell me how much I should produce. Now, as we said, what the manager has to do is they have to make then these incremental decisions. And that's why these marginals are so important, because they tell me what's the additional revenue to doing something one more time, what's the additional cost to doing something one more time. When should you do it? Whenever the marginal benefits are greater than the marginal costs, then yes, you should do it more. However, when the marginal costs are greater than the marginal benefits, then I should do it less. But then it's the act of doing something more or less that then changes the benefits and the costs. With again the goal being that I want to set the two equal to each other. Okay. So what do you see from this chapter then? That what it means then to do managerial economics then really is all about taking into account those opportunity costs. By talking about opportunity costs, that forced us into a discussion of why it's important to calculate present values. But that ultimately what the challenge is for the manager is how to make that optimal decision on the margin by setting their marginal benefits equal to their marginal costs. These are the three things that managers have to do, and that economists at least believe that they can contribute to how a manager understands what they're doing.